Okay, namaste. Namaste, Marie Russell here. This will be my last little video clip that I do today before I take a little swim. But I wanted to take this opportunity to speak a little bit about It's Yoga and the history of It's Yoga and my journey with It's Yoga. What is It's Yoga? What is Ashtanga? Kind of speak to that whole thing. Because it's a great story, and I think that in many ways we've come so far, and I want to put this information out into the world in a larger way because I have such a deep desire to share these tools and this philosophy and this lifestyle with anyone who's interested, because it's just so powerful and it's so healing. And it's such an amazing way to grow oneself and to experience life. So I'll kind of back up a little bit. My journey with It's Yoga started in around 2001. It's quite sunny. And I had a hip surgery. And it was quite interesting because I was in this relationship when I was 16, and I was so in love, and it was like I thought the one, and I was gonna, we were gonna make babies and live happily ever after, and it was perfect, and I didn't have to worry about anything. And the relationship ended quite abruptly when I was about 18 and a half, and I went into this just massive depression. I'm not sure. I mean, essentially we're children mentally until we're about 21. So I think that I just was so wrapped up in that relationship and that being a reality and that lasting forever that when it ended, I just couldn't deal. So for a good year, I was pretty depressed. And I think now in retrospect, when I look back at it, I can see that. But about a year later, I found a new boyfriend, which was great, right? And everything was going fairly well. And I'm going to offer full disclosure, which I've never done in my life. So here it is. But I started having sex with this new boyfriend. And I liked it a lot. But the catch here was that I was raised to be a virgin, if you will, before I was married, and so I had some really massive guilt around exploring my sexuality, and it was deep. It was really deep stuff. I mean, to the extent that I was really ingrained that you were supposed to be chaste and your husband, and I mean just all sorts of crazy insanity. But one evening, I was sitting and I went to stand up, and I had been feeling some pain in my hip for like 6 months, and I just was like, I just couldn't get over it. I was riding my bike, I was at Ohio State, and I would like lift my leg, and it was just hurting so much. And one afternoon, I just broke my hip, and I kind of passed out, and I woke up in the hospital, and there was this beautiful doctor. I'll never forget her face. It was just, she was so beautiful. African American and tall and just so powerful. And I kind of come to, and she puts this x-ray up, and she goes, well, it looks benign, but it has cancerous tendencies, and I'm not really sure, what we're going to do, but you definitely need to have some surgery, and blah, 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 all the stuff. So my parents came down. It was a whole thing, and I had surgery, and I was not recovering very well from that whole experience. I was kind of walking with a limp. I was just even more deep into my depression and just feeling so guilty because I knew it had to do with the sex. I was so convinced that I was being punished. But at the same time was also just so committed to like continuing on with my life. I remember I still was a camp counselor. I was like limping around on my crutches. But I had a friend, a beautiful friend, who said to me, why don't you come try yoga? There's a studio, it's called It's Yoga, it's all about breathing, it's $90 for 90 days, I think you'll really benefit. And she kept pushing me, and I was like, no, yoga's weird, I'm a Christian, I couldn't possibly do yoga, that'll just further my guilt and I'll die and go to hell. And I just was so mentally not correct, if you will, around my concepts of how the world worked. And anyway, eventually I was so desperate and she was so persistent that I went. And I'm so grateful to her eternally for that first invitation to come practice Ashtanga Vinyasa at It's Yoga in Columbus, Ohio. And that first class, I remember I was in a pose called Janu Shirshasana, seated tree pose, and I was leaning forward, and I heard my inner teacher for the first time, or what I learned was my inner teacher say, "This is so good for you." And I was like literally disappointed, like, who said that? Did someone say that out loud? It wasn't the voice of the teacher who was instructing the class. I was like, who said that? This is so good for you. And I was looking around, and there was this woman in front of me that had a cast on her foot, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. As I was always into movement and being physical, but I couldn't get my competitive self up to par, if you will. Like, I played field hockey for a minute in high school, and it was like the girl would come after me with her stick, and I'd be like, well, you have the ball. you can just have it. I don't want it that bad, So I loved yoga because everyone was kind of so into their own experience, and I felt like, wow, no one's even looking at me. No one cares what I'm doing or that I can't do certain things based on my hip. And I just felt so deeply moved and inspired from that first class that I just kept going back and back and back for more. And it was such a fun time in my life. There was about 4 of us girlfriends, and we would go to yoga, and right afterwards we'd light up cigarettes and buy beer or wine and eat a bunch of pizza or whatever. And so I wasn't necessarily implementing the whole on the mat and off the mat practice very well, but on some level I knew, and I used to remember, girls, we shouldn't be smoking after yoga. Let's at least wait an hour or something. We were young, and this is just how we were rolling back then. Anyway, I was almost done with college, and I went to Ohio State. I went to Washington, D.C. for an internship, and I didn't have my yoga practice there, and I couldn't find a studio that I liked. I really loved the It's Yoga system, and so I found myself in D.C., and I was loving my life, having lots of fun, but I was also really struggling in many ways. I was struggling because I was super stressed out. I was trying to do school and trying to do good at my job, and I was drinking too much, and I was eating too much, and I was gaining weight, and I was dealing with cystic acne, and just mentally, if I look back at that time in my life, I was just a total disaster. And I was 23, and it just was so clear to me that when I was practicing yoga, I was happier and healthier, even though I had some unhealthy habits. And when I wasn't practicing yoga, I was just spinning out of control. So eventually my internship was completed, and I didn't renew my opportunity there. I moved back to Columbus primarily because of the yoga studio, and I got a job bartending on the weekends, and then working at a senator's office downtown. And I was super excited, and I loved politics. That's kind of what was my study, international studies, ancient history, and particularly conflict resolution, because I was really interested in the situation in the Middle East, and I really wanted to make a difference and work towards peace and be a part of that movement. And the more I got involved with this senator, the more I just was like, this is not working for me. I was just not healthy. I was super stressed out. And the yoga I was getting more and more addicted to the yoga. I couldn't get enough of it. And I remember at one point I just decided, I saw what was happening to one of my colleagues who had Crohn's disease and was literally she was younger than me and she was falling apart. And this senator was kind of having fun at the whole thing, watching the two of us, his legislative assistants, just we were getting annihilated. More and more projects, and it was just a really unhealthy situation. And I remember saying to him, I said, I'm complete with this job. I don't know if that was my language, would be now, but I said, I'm finished, and I actually think you're quite evil. And he said to me, "You might be right about that, honey. Good move for you." And he just kind of released me, and I thought I was going to move to a different senator's office, and he made sure that that didn't happen, which was a blessing in disguise, because 2 weeks later I was in San Francisco. I got on the internet. I found that the It's Yoga teacher training was happening, and I thought, well, this is my opportunity. I went to my yoga teacher, who wasn't doing a teacher training till the next summer, and I said, listen, I just need to figure out this yoga. And she said something that was interesting that stuck with me still to this day. And she said that the It's Yoga San Francisco teacher training is not comprehensive. It's not comprehensive. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, you know, Larry Schultz he's a party guy, and he's wonderful, but it's not comprehensive. You're not going to learn enough about, you know, the history of yoga and the Bhagavad Gita and, you know, the spiritual texts and things like that. It's not comprehensive. It's not comprehensive. She kept saying that. But for me, it didn't matter, because I had met Larry once at a workshop in Columbus, and my cousin and I had gone to his class. We skipped our own college classes to jump into it. And I remember being in his class thinking, like, oh my God, I love him. I love him. I loved his style. And Larry is the founder of It's Yoga in San Francisco. He kind of walked in, I thought, what a weird name, what a strange name for a yoga teacher, Larry Schultz. Like, shouldn't he be Yogi Maharaji somebody, you know? He was just like this guy from New York, and he kind of had this accent, and he spoke just so kindly, and he had such a great sense of humor. And at one point in the class, I kind of fell down, and he was like, that was awesome, like, good job. And I was like thinking to myself, doesn't he want to correct me? Like, why is he so happy all the time? I was just so attracted to his energy. So when my teacher was saying all that stuff about him, it really didn't matter to me, because I just there was something really calling me to San Francisco. So my mother was so gracious. She lent me some money, and I kind of sold everything, and I just was like, peace out. I'm going to San Francisco, literally with flowers in my hair. I've got to figure this thing out. And I walked into the doors of It's Yoga San Francisco, and it was on Folsom Street in those days, south of Market for you San Franciscans, and just was like, wow. And I heard my inner teacher for the second time say, this is so good for you. And it said, I'm never leaving this place. I got to the desk, and I was like, wow, I just love it here. I sat down in a circle for that first day, and Larry said, he sat down and he read to us from the book The Places You Go by Dr. Seuss. I was like, this guy is so amazing. I'm just so into it. And he was like the first guy I had met with gray hair that was so youthful and so funny and so light. Like he still had this access to like this joy. And I had never really met anyone with gray hair, particularly a man that was just so joyful and so happy. It was like surprising. It wasn't like, working so hard or very serious about things. And so I was super attracted to Larry, just his energy, and I loved him as my teacher. That whole month in San Francisco was just brilliant. And Larry was very generous. He had opened up his morning practice and said, if anyone wants to practice with me in the morning, I'm here at 7:30. And the training in those days started at 12 noon. And so I was like, oh, that's great. That's awesome. And I'm not a morning person, but I walked every day down to the studio, down the hill. I remember like climbing over like homeless people and people doing heroin and smoking weed. And San Francisco is just, such a melting pot of energies and just loving it. And that first day, I remember nobody was there but me and Larry. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. Like I totally thought that everyone in my group was going to take advantage of that invitation. But as Spirit would have it, it was just me. And he put his mat, and then he put me in front of him, and he just said, do what I do. I was like, okay. So that's really how I learned to practice, and now it's part of our trainings. We call it Follow the Yogi. So someone basically leads the routine without any words, and we just do what they do. And so at one point, I fell flat on my face. He went up to an elbow stand. He was 54 when I met him. I was 24. And met him in the teacher training. He went up to an elbow stand. I was like, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And I went up and I crashed and I almost hit him. And I was like, oh my God, I started laughing. Later he would tell me that was the moment that he knew that I had what it took. So we practiced every morning, and it was amazing, and the training was amazing. And I really struggled, though, with so much of the philosophy of yoga, because I couldn't really wrap my head around it. I remember at one point the beautiful Katie Cariff, who co-facilitated the trainings in those days with Larry, she did a lot of like the technique and alignment, the comprehensive, the stuff, whereas Larry did a lot of the philosophy and things like that. But one day Katie was talking about the 8 limbs of yoga, and these are beautiful, and I'll talk about them in another segment. But one of the concepts is that there's this theme called ahimsa, which is nonviolence. And Katie was speaking to that moving into the space even with our words. So she was comparing it to this idea of when we speak about other yoga modalities or yoga instructors, that we speak to them we speak about them in a non-violent way, and that judgment is a way of being violent. And it just blew me away. I was like, wow, these people are for real. And I remember raising my hand and being like, Katie, I'm from Ohio. That doesn't really work. That's not like the thought system that we operate on there. It's a lot about judgment. It's a lot about competitiveness. It's a lot about jealousy going on there. At least that was the thought system that I had adapted to. In a way, I knew that it wasn't true, and because I knew that judgment never made me feel good. But I never really saw it as a way that you could get out of that. I didn't know that there was an alternative. I didn't know that there was a way of living without that. And the yoga philosophy just really spoke to me about the fact that yoga essentially means that we're all one. And the yoga practice can be summed up in the first three Yoga Sutras, and I'll just give it to you real quick. Yoga Sutras is basically the essence of all yoga philosophy, and all of it comes back to this one book written by Patanjali about 5,000 years ago. Patanjali being either one man or more likely a group of yogis that were scientists and were like trial and error, like if we do this, how does this happen? They were trying to figure out the nature of who they were. And the first 3 sutras are threads of wisdom, if you will. The first one says, now is the time for yoga. Now is the time for yoga. Or the disposition or the discipline of yoga, the exposition or the discipline of yoga begins now. Second one says, yoga is the restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff. Another translation is, yoga is stopping how the mind turns. Another translation for the first one is, now the practice of wholeness, of realizing your wholeness begins. It's pretty powerful. And the third one says, because then the seer then sees himself, or the seer abides in his own nature. So let me kind of, in other words, we start the practice of yoga, which is stopping how the mind turns, the patterns that the mind takes towards fear, illusion, judgment, anxiety, stress, etc. Stopping that for a moment. Just stop it, just for a moment, so that we can align to the vertical, if you will, and then we see who we truly are. Then we abide in our own nature, and that is really powerful. To be in my own nature. In that space, what problems do I have? The second one then, the fourth goes to say, because at other times, I take on my mental modifications. I become them. So essentially it's like, I don't even know. It's like I fall asleep. I don't even know who I am. So I think I am my thoughts about that person, or I think that I am not good enough, or I think that I'm unlovable, or I think that I'm bad in some ways, if you will, instead of, if I can stop that, I can see who I really am. I can kind of step beside that. So that first month for me in teacher training was really powerful. The other major piece that kind of clicked in my mind, that major aha moment, was when this beautiful teacher called Ashley Nunn gave us a talk on the chakras, the energetic systems in the body. And she was speaking to the second chakra. And I can give another, at some point we'll talk about the chakras together. But the second one being where we hold our sexual guilt. And I started this conversation sharing with you how I had so much of the sexual guilt, and it residing in my hips, and then having my tumor in the hip. And then I was like, wow, my mind and my body are connected. Like, that's amazing. So all of that unhealthy thinking, all of that adapted thinking about sex and how it should be and how I was bad or how I had upset God. To just pause for a moment. There's some cute little police officers on bikes, making sure everybody's doing good at the beach today. But anyway, I started to realize that my mind was connected to my body, and that if I had unhealthy thoughts, that my body was going to be unhealthy. And thus began really the journey of yoga for me, being a mental practice, starting here. So it's all about thoughts. A Course in Miracles, which I'm also a student of, teaches us that your mind has power. You can't change that. Your mind has power because your mind is created by God, and God created the universe. I mean, look at the power of the ocean. So your mind has power, and that you don't have any choice over. It's powerful. You didn't create your mind. But what you do have a choice in is whether you put your mind's energy towards love or towards fear. Loving thoughts or fear-based thoughts. So if I put the power of my mind towards fear, which has to do with I'm not good enough or smart enough or lovable or I'm guilty, I'm, like that. She's better, I'm not, all that stuff. It's powerful. It creates form on some level. That's non-negotiable. If I can teach my mind how to think and to align with the thoughts of God, and if God is love, which is the metaphysical understanding of what the universe is, God is love, and if I can realign to the thoughts of love, and if God created me, then I must be love too, then I start to shift, and then my healing begins. But I can say this, that this is a moment-to-moment conversation happening. And the first Yoga Sutra saying now is the time for yoga even has a bigger importance in my life and hopefully in the life of anyone who's interested in this path, that now, right now, I have a choice. Every thought I think creates form on some level. So I shared in another video this morning about my cancer journey and it's unloving thought. What unloving thoughts do I still hold about myself and others? Even an unloving thought about others affects me because ideas never leave their source. So if I'm thinking something negative about somebody else, it's actually I'm holding the thought. So it affects me. That's why it's so essential, and Jesus was always talking about, love your neighbor as yourself, because that is the truth. That guy over there is me too. It just looks like we're different because we have different bodies, and he's over there and I'm over here. So that first month for me was so powerful in San Francisco because it really was the beginning of my awakening and my awareness around my own power, that I actually had power to affect my life. I wasn't a victim of my life. That hip surgery was not because, I was being punished by God. It was because I had unhealthy thoughts. And God is giving me permission to use my mind in whichever way I want, towards love or towards fear. And to the extent that I continue to choose love, I will continue to resonate on that frequency. To the extent that I choose fear, I will resonate on that frequency. And we all know the difference between when we're in the state of love and when we're in the state of fear. Love is peace, right? I'm at peace. Fear is what? Stress, anxiety, judgment, etc. One of my favorite and most profound teachers, Dorothy DeVac, used to say that stress is a sophisticated form of fear. It's so true, right? Stress is a sophisticated form of fear. It's like a grown-up fear. It's like, I don't want to say that I'm afraid I don't have a time to complete this project. Instead, I say, I'm so stressed I have this project to complete. So anyway, back to my story about It's Yoga and San Francisco and my journey with this whole practice. Towards the end of the training, I was really kind of struggling to step fully into this new thought system, and kind of really feeling like I wanted to hold on to some of my old patterns and some of my own, concepts of the world, because in a way we become addicted to our fears, we become attached to our suffering. It makes us feel alive on some level. So one of the parts of our teacher training is that at the end you teach a class. And so I taught my class, my modified primary series, and remember after that class, one of the things that was very controversial about Larry Schultz was that he smoked marijuana and loved it. I mean, marijuana was a tool for him to connect with spirit, and it was a plant. And I remember he used to say to me, Marie, it's just like parsley or oregano, it's just a plant, it just helps you stay in the light, that's all. But for a lot of us, we have these concepts about what yoga teachers should be like, and they shouldn't, smoke anything, let alone marijuana, and they should be clean, and they should wear white, and, blah, 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 all that stuff. But again, those are judgments. And one of the things that was so amazing about Larry, one of the ways in which he set himself up as a yoga teacher, was that he would say, I'm not the teacher, you're the teacher. I don't want to be your yoga teacher. I could be your yoga mentor, I could be your yoga cheerleader, but I'm just like you. We're equals here. And that was really profound, I think, especially from someone of his caliber. I mean, he had been studying yoga for over 30 years. But he never wanted to be above anyone. He didn't want to be the teacher. He wanted us to all be equals, and that was just so amazing. But anyway, after that class, I went upstairs to his loft with a few of the other students, and I smoked some marijuana with him. And that stuff was strong. It was really, really strong in San Francisco. I mean, I had like one hit, and I was just like, whoa, my mind was like going in all different directions. I don't know what was happening. It was just a really mind-opening, altering experience. And I remember leaving the studio and going to get a bite and walking around the city and just having this like really profound experience. It was like I was wearing different lenses. Like everything just looked different. And I ended up walking back up to my apartment, and I sat down. I just felt really guided to sit down and journal, and so I went into this little like restaurant cafe place, and I sat down and I was journaling, and the bartender came over and he said, can I get you something? And I ordered a beer, and I was like journaling, and he put the beer down and he looked at me, and the first thing he said, it looks like you've just seen God. I went, how did you know? Because I really did feel like I was starting to see this inner light within me start to shine, and it was just so profound. I was writing and I was journaling, and it was like all of the things that I learned about God growing up were seen in a different light. It was like I was shaving away all the barriers to love, all of the judgment, all of the guilt and perceptions around God that were untrue. And I was starting to feel like so much lighter around my life and around my experience. And not to say that that's lasted. I mean, it's been 15 years since that day, but I think that Spirit or God gives us these experiences to call upon in our dark moments and to remember the truth of who we are. So we have constantly being invited to lift our consciousness into that space. And that was one of the first moments for me where I started to realize that my healing started in my mind, and letting go some of those false concepts about myself and others that I was holding on to, because they were essentially causing disease in my body. And disease, and we can see it on a collective level. I mean, again, if thought has power and we can't change that, if we collectively think certain peoples are bad, or certain countries, and then look at what happens. So I think when we start to really shift our consciousness, wow, do we have the power to change all sorts of things, not only our personal realities, but the world. And essentially that's what yoga is all about. It's Yoga International. So it was interesting to me. I graduated from that teacher training. I ended up falling in love with Larry Schultz. That's just what happened. He was just so amazing. And it was almost as if I couldn't help myself. It was just my destiny was to spend more and more time with this man, not only as a teacher, but as a friend and a partner. And that's another story of how we fell in love, and I'll give that another time. But what happened subsequently from that decision to stay with Larry was that I had 7 years of training with him every day. I mean, every day we were practicing yoga together. Every day I was sitting in the circle with him. Every day I was working at It's Yoga. I was, answering emails. I was teaching classes. It was just such an amazing experience for me. And through all of it, there was just this constant theme that I see now, that perhaps I didn't see then, which was that Larry was preparing me for this moment in time, for this role now that I have in terms of our international community and leading this company of It's Yoga International into our next phase and our next generation. Those 7 years were amazing, and Larry passed away in February 27th of 2011. And in those few months before he passed, there was just so much that transpired, and even to the extent of, I remember a very specific conversation of him saying to me, "Are you ready? Are you ready?" And now when I look at it, I see what he was talking about. But after he passed away, we formed a company called It's Yoga International. A few of us, and primarily with the support of Dorothy DeVac, who is a master life coach and was my mentor since 2005. She married me and Larry. She really kind of supported me in getting organized, and sat on our board of directors and board of advisors for 7 years. She passed away in July of 2018, but is still with us, obviously, in spirit, as is Larry. And our mission is really what Larry said it was back in the day, which was the mission of It's Yoga is to share the love of the practice. And that's what we're still doing today. We offer teacher trainings, 200, 300, and 500-hour trainings. We have studios around the world. We have a studio in Cancun. We have a studio in Brighton, studio in Florence, Italy, Canary Islands, and Fuerteventura, and Thailand. And it's just amazing how this group of people have come together. And we've weeded out a lot. I mean, it's not always been, we had lots of studios at one point, and now we're down to a few. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that we have weeded out so much that it's been so essential to me that all of us as trainers and facilitators, so if any It's Yoga training that you go to that you see listed on itsyoga.com, or a retreat, that we stand behind our trainers, not because they knew Larry or anything like that, but because they're continuing to do their work off the mat. And because the practice and the training was so profound for me in terms of the transformation that it initiated, it's been very important to me that as we step into this next generation with Larry on the other side, if you will, that the integrity of the practice and the legacy that we carry forth is authentic and is grounded in the truth of what yoga is, which is uniting your consciousness to its highest potential. So our divine potential is endless and limitless, and it's just a matter of us really removing the blocks to love, letting go of our old perceptions, our disempowering thoughts, and really stepping into the truth of who we are and operating from that place. And like I said before, that's a moment-to-moment practice. So that's a little bit about It's Yoga, about my journey with it all, and I'm really grateful for your listening today and for your interest in what we can offer. We also do private coaching, and there's all sorts of things that we're into, and if you're interested, you can write in the comments below or contact me at marie@itsyoga.com, info@itsyoga.com, and we're here to serve, and our mission is to share the love of the practice. So if that resonates with you on any level, you are so welcome. And yeah, it was interesting. The one thing that I will leave you with was that I was in my early 20s super interested in conflict resolution. And I found through all of these teacher trainings, I sat in at least 50 trainings with Larry, and now, gosh, it must be up to 100, and it's such a privilege, every single one of them unique in and of itself. But what is constant in the thread that unites all of them is that it's conflict resolution within ourselves. It's resolving the conflict within ourselves And in that, we resolved our conflicts in our personal relationships, in our personal environments, and that starts to weed out. And then we collectively start to resolve conflict in a larger scale. And that's really what I'm interested in. And whether we do it from the political space or we do it from the yoga space, it's all the same, because the bottom line is that healing happens. And when healing happens, we can start to create a broader vision and a greater vision, not only for ourselves, but for the world. So that's what we're up to. Sending you, obviously, lots of sunshine and energy from the sea. Namaste.